Just say, hi, Carson. How you doing? We hope you're feeling good today. There we go. All right, so factoring polynomials, day 3. So we're going to factor by grouping. Factoring by grouping, you know you're going to factor by grouping if you have 4 terms. The very first thing you should do is always check to see if there's a greatest common factor for all 4 of the terms before you factor it. So we've got so I always look at the numbers. You've got a 9, that's odd, and you've got a 2. So there's no way there's a greatest common factor for those 4 numbers, for the 4 coefficients. So I look at the coefficients, and then I look at the letters. Well, if I've got negative 12 on the end and it's just a number, it's a constant, there's no way that I can factor a variable out of those 4 terms. So it doesn't have a greatest common factor. So after I check that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide my 4 terms into 2 separate sections. First, we look at the first 2, and then we look at the 3 and 4, the third and the fourth term. So I want to look for a greatest common factor for these 2 terms first. So what's the biggest number that divides evenly into 9 and negative 54? 9, good. And then I want to also look at the variables. They have variables in common. This one has x squared and this one has x to the third. So they both have x squared. So that's what I'm going to factor out. So in the front, I'm going to put my 9x squared, and in parentheses, I'm going to put what would be left when I factor that out. Good. I have x, and then minus, and this is 6, and the x squareds match. Okay, you guys good with that? Mm-hmm. Yes, questions? How do I get x squared from x cubed? Okay, so when I factor, when I take a greatest common factor, and this one's 9x cubed, and this one's negative 54x squared, they both have variables. This one has 3 x's, this one has 2 x's. So they have 2 x's in common. So it's the least amount of variables they both have. Then, if you need a little help trying to figure out why that's 9, you can do your little factor, your upside down birthday cake. We factor it, 25, 26, 27, 3, 9, thank you, 3 and 3. And then, so they have a 9 in common. They have a 9 and they have 2 x's in common. So that's one way if it helps over to the side, because sometimes it's not quite as, evident when you first look at it. You can, factor it out and circle what they have in common. That's going to be the greatest common factor. This one, positive 2x and negative 12. What do they both have in common? 2. So they have 2 in common. The negative 12 doesn't have a variable, so there's no way they can have a variable in common. So we're going to put plus, because it's a positive 2. And then inside the parentheses, I'm going to reduce. My 2x divided by 2 is just x. And here, negative 6. What do you notice about what I factored so far? Yeah, they have that x minus 6 in common. There are 2 terms that are multiplied by x minus 6. So what we do is we take these 2 numbers, these 2 terms that are multiplied through x minus 6, and we just put them together. Because all this says is take 9x squared, distribute it through x minus 6, and then take 2 and distribute it through x minus 6. So that's how we factor by grouping. Okay, this is factor by grouping. Okay, look one more time. So the 9x squared is multiplied by x minus 6. That's what this part means. This positive 2 is right here. And it's also multiplied by x minus 6. Do you see what I mean? So I take the greatest common factor in front, and I put them in one set of parentheses, and they're both multiplied by the factor that they have in common. Does that kind of answer your question? No? Oh, I see what you're thinking. Not really, because in the first part here we have 9x squared times x minus 6, and then our plus 2 times x minus 6. So they're only multiplied by it one time. Do you see what I mean? So my distributive property allows me to rewrite, that's the first part right here, and then this is the second part. Do you see what I mean? I'm just rewriting it with the distributive property to simplify it. And so this is my factored form. Does that make sense? Okay, good. I like when y'all ask questions. That's good. Lots of questions, because I want you to know. All right, let's look at this one. Is there a greatest common factor? 24, but 4 doesn't divide evenly into 3. Yeah, so there isn't a greatest common factor for all 4 terms, so we're going to cut it. I like the way you said that. So now we want to factor out the greatest common factor of 20mn squared plus 4n. And I heard someone say 4, do they have a letter in common? They have an n in common because this one is 4n. So in the front I have 4n, and it's going to be times 5mn, and then plus 1. Okay, so one way that you can check while you're working is think about, if I multiplied 4n by 5mn, would I get the original? Okay, yeah, it's like we're factoring, we're undividing. I mean, we're unmultiplying. We're unmultiplying, so we're dividing. We're factoring that out, and so you can check, this would make 20, then I'd have mn squared. This would make 4n times 1 is 4n. So you can kind of check as you're working and make sure that if you multiplied, you get the original. And the nice thing about factor by grouping is if I do it right, this should be 5mn plus 1. Okay, I know that, and that might help me decide what I'm going to factor out of negative 15. So if I take negative 15 and I divide it by 5, what did I factor out? Negative 3. So it has to be a negative 3. Negative 3 times 5mn gives me negative 15mn. And then my negative 3 times the 1 gives me the negative 3. So now I just rewrite it as 4n minus 3. And they are both multiplied by 5mn plus 1. And that is factor by grouping. So you do it in 2 sets. And y'all probably had a couple of rare ones like that in Algebra 1, but not a lot. Question?
So the second one, like an answer, the second parenthesis, the parentheses, will that always be the same? Like
Yes. When you factor by grouping, they'll always be the same, so you know that it's wrong if they're not the same. Then it tells you, oh, I got to go back and look at it. So this is kind of the weird one that has a greatest common factor before you factor by grouping. Does anybody know what the greatest common factor is? It is, it's 3. So you could factor them out. 3 divides evenly, and I usually look at the little numbers. So 18, 18, yeah, but 6 doesn't divide evenly into 21. So it's 3. So I think of the numbers that multiply to make 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6, and I just start from, the biggest one, and 3 is the only one that divides evenly into all of them. So if you have a problem like this, you should factor out the 3 first before you do your factor by grouping. So let's see. Let me look here. That makes this 35ab minus 30a minus 7b plus 6. Okay, so now I cut it in half. So I'm looking at what's the greatest common factor of 35ab and negative 30a? 5, good. And are there any letters in common? A. Sometimes it does that. Wait 1 second, it'll start writing again. Well, maybe not. It's being a not so smart board now. I don't know what it's doing. It's thinking. It's thinking about doing something. Okay, it stopped. Okay, so we're still going to have our 3 in our answer, but I'm going to kind of ignore it for a minute. I have my 5a on the outside, and inside I have 7b minus 6. You guys good with that? Okay, so let's look at negative 7b plus 6. I know that I'm going to factor out, when I factor out whatever I'm factoring out, I'm going to be left with 7b minus 6. So what would I divide negative 7b by to make it positive 7b? Negative 1. Good. So negative 1 times 7b makes negative 7b, and then negative 1 times negative 6 makes positive 6. Okay, so when I write this answer, I kind of ran out of room a little bit, so I might have to write it over to the other side. I'm going to take these, and I'm going to put them in parentheses together, and I leave the 3 out in the front. Good, because I factored that out. So it doesn't go away completely, because if I don't leave it there when I multiply, it wouldn't make the equivalent of the original equation. Good, so that would be my answer. And I just have to leave that 3 there. Leave the 3 you factored out there. I'd love to hear that. Good, makes sense. Any questions, though? If you all have questions, ask me. Then she has an example of factoring a trinomial. Does it have a greatest common factor? 3x cubed plus 27x squared plus 42. What's its greatest common factor? 3. They're all divisible by 3, and 3 is the smallest number. So sometimes I just look at the smallest number. And then an x. They all have an x in common. Good. So on the outside, I'm going to have 3x. On the inside, when I reduce, I have x squared plus 9x plus 14. So now it's just a trinomial I'm factoring, just a quadratic equation. So what multiplies to make 14 and adds to make 9? 7 and 2? Good. Are the lights off making y'all sleepy? Or is it the math? Because I can turn the lights on if it helps, but sometimes I think this time of day it's kind of relaxing a little bit. I just don't want to be too relaxing. All right, so intercept form. Intercept form is just factored or root form. It's what you just did. That's what you